Some people report something very curious after a certain inner shift. Problems that once seemed to follow them begin to disappear. Conflicts that used to find them again and again suddenly stop showing up. Even certain people who once interfered in their lives slowly fade into the background. It almost feels as if the system that once pressured you simply stops noticing you. Nothing dramatic changes on the outside. The world continues the same way. The same environments exist, the same personalities are still there, and life keeps moving forward. Yet the patterns that once pulled you into tension somehow stop locking onto you, and that raises an unsettling question. What exactly do you begin to perceive that makes the system stop reacting to you? What changes inside a person that alters the way these invisible dynamics respond? And maybe the most curious part of all is this: why does almost no one talk about it? Most people imagine control in obvious ways: governments, companies, institutions, rules, structures that can be pointed at. But there is another layer operating quietly beneath all of that. A layer so subtle that it rarely becomes visible to the person living inside it. It is not a single authority, and it is not controlled by one group. In many ways, it behaves more like a field of reactions than a designed machine. A network of responses constantly adjusting to the signals people send through their behavior, emotions, expectations, and attention. Every system that becomes stable learns something very simple: patterns. In physics, when a complex system receives repeated stimuli, it begins to organize its responses around those inputs. Circuits adapt to signals. Algorithms adapt to user behavior. Ecosystems adapt to recurring environmental conditions. Over time, the system becomes efficient at predicting what will happen next. And once prediction becomes possible, reaction becomes automatic. Something very similar happens in human life. Without realizing it, each person broadcasts patterns constantly, not through words alone, but through reactions. The way someone responds to pressure, the emotions that appear when something goes wrong, the type of situations that immediately provoke anger, fear, or the need to defend. These reactions become signals, and signals, when repeated enough times, become predictable variables inside a system. Imagine someone who always reacts strongly to criticism. The moment criticism appears, their emotional response follows almost immediately. Frustration, defense, the urge to explain themselves, the need to prove something. If this pattern repeats long enough, it becomes reliable. The environment around that person begins to learn it. People who interact with them sense it. Social dynamics adapt to it. Even situations that seem unrelated begin to trigger similar reactions, not because life is conspiring against them, but because predictable responses create stable feedback loops. The system does not need to understand you in a personal way, it only needs to detect the signal. And emotional predictability is one of the clearest signals a human being can produce. This is why some individuals seem to encounter the same types of tension again and again, the same arguments, the same personality types, the same forms of pressure appearing in slightly different costumes. It is not that the world is endlessly inventing new problems. Often the system is simply responding to familiar inputs. Think about how recommendation algorithms work online. They observe your behavior, what you click, how long you watch, what you ignore. After a while, the algorithm does not need to guess. It already knows what will trigger your attention. Human environments operate in a strangely similar way. Your emotional responses teach the system how to engage with you. If frustration reliably produces action, situations that provoke frustration continue appearing. If anxiety consistently triggers compliance, environments that generate anxiety tend to repeat themselves. If conflict reliably captures your attention, conflict becomes a powerful hook. None of this requires a hidden mastermind. It emerges naturally whenever patterns meet feedback. Over time, many people unknowingly become deeply integrated into these cycles. They believe they are reacting to life as it happens, but in reality their reactions are helping maintain the very conditions they are responding to. It becomes a loop: situation, reaction, system adjustment, new situation, reaction again. And because the external form of the situation may change slightly each time, the deeper pattern often goes unnoticed. A different job, but the same type of conflict with authority. A different relationship, but the same emotional dynamic. A different challenge, yet somehow it feels strangely familiar. When you begin to look closely, a quiet question starts to appear beneath all of this. What if the system is not only reacting to what happens around you, but also to how you are likely to respond? What if much of the pressure people feel is not random at all, but the result of patterns that have become easy for the system to activate? Once this possibility enters your awareness, certain memories begin to rearrange themselves. Moments that once felt isolated start to form connections. Situations that seemed like bad luck begin to look more like recurring signals. And slowly, another realization begins to surface. If systems learn from repeated reactions, then something else must also be true. The more predictable the reaction, the easier it becomes for the cycle to continue, which leads to a much more uncomfortable observation that many people resist seeing at first. Some problems do not repeat because they are powerful. They repeat because the system already knows exactly which reaction they will trigger. At first, the pattern does not look like a pattern. It looks like coincidence, bad luck, difficult people, stressful environments, a series of isolated events that seem unrelated to one another. Most people experience life this way, moving from one situation to the next without stopping long enough to notice the deeper rhythm underneath. But there is usually a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes almost unsettling, when a person begins to sense that something is repeating. Not the exact event, but the structure of it. The conflict feels familiar. The emotional pressure feels familiar. Even the type of person involved seems strangely recognizable, as if life keeps introducing different actors to play the same role in the same scene. Someone leaves a toxic workplace only to find themselves in another job with a manager who behaves in a nearly identical way. A person ends one difficult relationship, promising themselves they will choose differently next time, only to discover the same emotional dynamic appearing again months or years later. At first, it feels unfair. Why does this keep happening? Why does the same type of tension keep showing up? But the real signal that something deeper is happening is not the situation itself. It is the emotional response that appears almost instantly when the situation begins. The body tightens in a familiar way. The mind rushes toward the same defensive thoughts. The same internal narrative activates before there is even time to fully understand what is happening. And because the reaction arrives so quickly, it feels justified, natural, automatic. Most people believe their reactions are simply responses to what the world is doing to them. But when a pattern repeats enough times, another possibility begins to appear. What if the system already knows how you will react? Think about how easily certain buttons can be pushed. There are words, tones, or behaviors that instantly activate frustration in some people. Others react strongly to feeling ignored. Some cannot tolerate uncertainty. Others feel an overwhelming need to correct misunderstandings immediately. Each of these reactions becomes a kind of emotional shortcut. The moment the trigger appears, the response follows almost automatically. And the system surrounding you, social environments, group dynamics, workplace cultures, even personal relationships, learns these shortcuts much faster than you might expect. Not consciously, and not with malicious intent most of the time. But through repetition, people observe what produces results. They notice which pressures make someone react, which situations create urgency, which emotional signals lead to predictable behavior. Over time, the pattern becomes stable. That stability is what allows the cycle to continue. You may believe you are responding freely to each situation, but if the reaction is always the same, the system does not need to guess. It already understands how to activate that response. This is why certain individuals feel like they are constantly being pulled into the same kinds of struggles. Arguments that escalate quickly, situations where they feel the need to defend themselves, moments where they feel misunderstood, challenged, or cornered. Different environments, but somehow the same emotional choreography plays out again and again. And the more intense the reaction becomes, the clearer the signal is. From the perspective of a system, strong emotional responses are highly visible variables. They stand out, they create movement, they generate predictable outcomes. If frustration always leads you to argue, the system registers that pathway. If anxiety always pushes you to comply or over-explain, that pathway becomes visible too. Eventually, the cycle becomes so well established that it almost feels like life is testing you personally. But systems do not test individuals. They simply respond to patterns. The strange part is that the person inside the cycle rarely sees the mechanism clearly at first. The focus remains on the external situation, on the other person's behavior, on the apparent injustice of what is happening. And sometimes those external factors are genuinely difficult, but when similar scenarios appear again and again, something else is usually present beneath the surface. A predictable reaction that keeps the loop active. This realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges a very common belief. Most people assume that fighting harder against these situations will eventually break the cycle. They believe that proving themselves, defending their position, or confronting the pressure directly will finally make the pattern stop. Yet something curious often happens instead. The more intensely someone reacts, the more clearly the system can see them. And the clearer that signal becomes, the easier it is for the same types of situations to find them again. Once people begin to notice these repeating patterns, a very natural instinct appears. They want to break free. They promise themselves that next time they will stand stronger, speak louder, defend themselves more clearly, and push back against whatever seems to be creating the pressure. From the outside, this feels like strength. It feels like taking control. But this is where one of the most silent mistakes begins to operate. Because the system that reacts to human behavior does not measure your intentions, it measures your signals. And the strongest signal a person can send is an intense emotional reaction. When someone argues passionately, tries to prove their point, fights to correct how they are perceived, or reacts strongly to pressure, something very clear becomes visible to the system around them. This person can be activated. Not in a mystical sense, but in a very practical one. Their reactions are predictable. Imagine a fire alarm that always goes off when smoke appears. The system does not need to wonder if it will react. The response is guaranteed. The moment the condition appears, the reaction follows. Many people function in a similar way emotionally, though they rarely see it that way. When criticism appears, they defend. When they feel misunderstood, they explain intensely. When they feel challenged, they push back. When they sense disrespect, they react immediately. None of these reactions are wrong by themselves. In fact, they often come from a desire to protect dignity, fairness, or truth. The problem is not the intention behind the reaction. The problem is the predictability of it. When reactions follow the same emotional pathway every time, the surrounding system begins to treat that pathway like a reliable switch, a button that can be pressed to produce a certain response. And once that button exists, it tends to be pressed again, sometimes by people who sense it intuitively, sometimes by environments that reward certain emotional dynamics, sometimes simply because patterns reinforce themselves over time. This is why many individuals who believe they are fighting against the system are, without realizing it, strengthening their visibility within it. Every argument, every intense reaction, every attempt to prove something sends out a signal. Here is energy. Systems react to energy. Think about how attention works online. Content that produces strong emotional reactions spreads faster. Algorithms amplify it because engagement is measurable. The stronger the reaction, the more visible the signal becomes. Human environments often follow a similar logic. Strong reactions create attention. Attention creates feedback. Feedback reinforces the pattern. Before long, the cycle becomes self-sustaining. The person feels they are constantly responding to pressure, while the system simply continues presenting the same types of triggers that reliably produce those reactions. This is the quiet mistake that keeps someone completely visible. They believe the path to freedom is reacting more effectively, explaining themselves better, or confronting every trigger directly. But every reaction strengthens the signal. Every attempt to prove something confirms that the trigger still works. It is similar to a motion sensor light outside a building. As long as movement appears in front of the sensor, the light turns on. The sensor does not care why the movement happened. It only registers that it did. Many systems surrounding human life behave in a comparable way. They react to emotional movement. If frustration consistently leads to confrontation, frustration becomes a reliable activation point. If pressure consistently leads to urgency, pressure becomes a reliable tool. From the inside, it feels like the system is constantly pushing. From the outside, the system is simply responding to signals it has already learned how to detect. And this is why people who are deeply trapped in these cycles often feel exhausted. They are constantly reacting, constantly defending, constantly trying to regain control of situations that seem to repeat in different forms. Yet the more energy they pour into these reactions, the more visible they remain within the very pattern they want to escape. This realization can be uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply rooted belief that resistance alone creates freedom. But systems that rely on predictable variables do not disappear when you fight them. They simply continue responding to the signals they already recognize. And that is where an interesting idea from physics begins to offer a different perspective, one that suggests that systems only continue reacting when certain variables remain active. There is a principle that appears again and again in the study of complex systems. Whether scientists are observing electrical circuits, ecological networks, or digital algorithms, one pattern keeps showing up. Systems respond only to the variables that interact with them. If a variable produces a signal, the system adjusts. If the signal disappears, the system eventually stops responding to it. This sounds simple, almost obvious. But when you look closely, it explains a surprising amount about how patterns form and disappear. Imagine a sensor connected to a circuit. As long as the sensor receives a signal, movement, heat, pressure, the circuit activates. Lights turn on, alarms sound, processes begin. The system reacts because the signal is present. But if the signal stops completely, something interesting happens. The system does not keep reacting out of habit or memory. It becomes inactive, not because it decided to stop, but because the variable that once activated it is no longer there. The interaction disappears. This principle exists everywhere in physics. Systems behave according to inputs and outputs. Energy flows through channels that are active, while inactive pathways slowly fade from relevance. In ecosystems, the same thing happens. If a certain food source disappears, the species that depended on it must adapt or move elsewhere. The ecosystem reorganizes itself around the variables that remain active. Even in technology, algorithms function this way. Recommendation systems respond to behavior. If a user stops clicking certain types of content, the algorithm gradually stops presenting it. Not because the algorithm made a moral decision, but because the interaction that once triggered that content has disappeared. The system simply adjusts to the signals it receives. Now consider what happens when this principle is applied to human behavior. Most people assume that external systems, social environments, workplace dynamics, recurring conflicts, have a kind of independent force. They feel as though these pressures exist on their own, constantly pushing against them. But when you look through the lens of systems thinking, another possibility appears. What if many of these pressures depend on specific signals in order to stay active? Signals such as emotional reactions, predictable responses, patterns of attention. When a situation repeatedly produces the same internal reaction, anger, urgency, fear, the need to defend or explain, those reactions function like variables interacting with the system. They create movement, they generate feedback. The system responds because something inside the person keeps activating the pathway. This does not mean the external world is imaginary or that other people are not responsible for their behavior. Difficult environments and challenging individuals absolutely exist. But systems are sustained through interaction. Without interaction, the pathway slowly loses relevance. Think about an argument between two people. Arguments survive through reaction. One person pushes, the other responds. The response creates more pressure, which produces another reaction, and the cycle continues. But if one side stops responding in the expected way, the structure of the interaction changes almost immediately. The system of conflict loses one of its key variables. The same dynamic appears in many areas of life. Certain workplace tensions survive because employees react to pressure in predictable ways. Some social conflicts persist because participants respond emotionally to the same triggers every time. Even personal stress patterns can function like feedback loops, repeating because the mind continues interacting with the same thoughts and reactions. From a systems perspective, the pattern remains active because the variables remain active. But when a variable disappears or stops producing a response, the system begins to reorganize. At first, there may be confusion. Systems that are used to predictable signals often attempt to trigger them again. Just like a sensor that scans for movement, the environment may present the familiar trigger once more. But if the expected reaction no longer appears, something subtle begins to shift. The pathway that once generated consistent feedback starts losing its function. Without the interaction, the system has nothing to respond to. This is where the idea becomes deeply personal. Because it raises a quiet but powerful possibility. Many of the cycles people experience in life may depend far more on their internal responses than they ever imagined. And when someone begins to see this clearly, not as a theory, but as a lived observation, something inside them starts to change in a way that is difficult to reverse. For most of life, reactions feel automatic. Something happens, and before there is time to think, the body responds. The chest tightens. The mind begins building arguments. Words form quickly, emotions rise, and the moment carries you forward almost without permission. It feels natural because it has always happened this way. But occasionally a different kind of moment appears. It is quiet, almost unremarkable from the outside. Yet internally something shifts. Instead of reacting immediately, there is a small pause. Just enough space to notice what is happening inside you before the reaction fully takes over. At first, this pause feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. You begin to see the reaction forming before it explodes outward, the same emotion that always appears, the same urge to defend yourself, explain something, correct someone, or push back against the pressure in front of you. For a brief instant, you see the pattern before becoming it, and that is when the realization begins, not as an intellectual idea, but as something directly observed in your own experience. You start to see that the situation itself is only part of what is happening. The other part, the part that completes the cycle, is the reaction forming inside you. For many people, this realization is deeply unsettling at first, because it means that the system they believed was entirely outside of them may depend, at least partially, on something happening within them. The pressure, the conflict, the repeated dynamics are not created by their reaction alone, but their reaction is often the piece that allows the pattern to continue. Without that reaction, the loop would not function in the same way. This does not mean suppressing emotions or pretending situations do not matter. It is not about becoming passive or indifferent. What changes is not the presence of emotion, but the awareness of it. Instead of being carried by the reaction automatically, you begin to observe it as it forms. And once you can see something clearly, your relationship to it begins to change. Imagine watching a wave approach the shore. If you are standing directly in its path without noticing it, the wave hits you with full force. But if you see it coming from a distance, you instinctively adjust. You move slightly. You step aside. The wave still exists, but your position in relation to it has changed. This is similar to what begins to happen internally. You start noticing the emotional waves before they completely take over your behavior. The old triggers still appear. Certain people still say the same things. Certain situations still arise in familiar ways. But something inside you is now observing the process, and that observation alone creates space. In that space, the automatic reaction loses some of its power. It may still appear, but it no longer feels like the only possible response. This is the moment when a person begins to realize something quietly powerful. Much of the control the system seemed to have depended on how quickly and predictably those reactions appeared. The system was interacting with signals, and those signals were often generated internally. Once you see this clearly, you cannot completely unsee it. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to look slightly different. Instead of immediately focusing on the external trigger, your attention starts moving inward, noticing the familiar emotional pattern forming, the heat rising, the urgency building, the desire to react quickly, And within that awareness, another possibility appears. What would happen if the reaction did not follow the usual path, not suppressed, not forced into silence, simply observed without immediately acting on it? For many people, this question marks the beginning of a subtle but profound shift, because once reactions stop appearing exactly as expected, the interaction between the individual and the surrounding system begins to change. At first, the change is almost invisible. The external world may still present the same triggers. The same personalities may still attempt the same dynamics. But internally, something is different now. The automatic signal that once activated the cycle is no longer guaranteed. And when that signal begins to weaken, something unusual starts to happen in the environment around you. At first, the change is so subtle that many people almost miss it. Nothing dramatic happens. The world does not suddenly transform. The same streets, workplaces, and conversations continue as before. But within the flow of everyday life, certain situations begin to shift in quiet and unexpected ways. Conflicts that used to appear regularly begin to fade. Conversations that once escalated into tension now end quickly or never fully ignite. People who used to challenge you, provoke you, or pull you into emotional exchanges seem to lose interest. Sometimes they move their attention somewhere else. Sometimes they simply stop engaging in the same way. It can feel strange when you first notice it, almost as if something that used to find you repeatedly no longer does. For someone who has spent years inside repeating cycles of pressure or conflict, this change can feel confusing. The instinct is to look outward for an explanation. Maybe the environment improved. Maybe the people around you matured. Maybe circumstances simply changed. But when you observe carefully, the external conditions are often surprisingly similar. The same personalities exist. The same environments continue operating. The same opportunities for tension are still present. Yet the interaction no longer unfolds the way it once did. It is almost as if the system stopped noticing you in the same way. Of course, you have not literally disappeared. You are still present in the same world, interacting with the same structures. But from the perspective of the patterns that once activated those cycles, something essential has changed. The signal is no longer there. Think of how a radar system works. Radar does not detect everything equally. It detects objects that reflect a certain signal back toward the source. If an object absorbs or redirects that signal differently, the radar may struggle to identify it clearly. The object still exists, but it no longer produces the expected feedback. Human systems behave in a surprisingly similar way. When someone reacts strongly to specific triggers, they produce a clear emotional reflection. The signal travels outward and returns through interaction. Conflict grows. Attention intensifies. The system recognizes the pattern and continues engaging with it. But when the expected reaction does not appear, the feedback weakens. A comment meant to provoke frustration meets calm instead. A situation that once triggered urgency now meets patience. An attempt to pull someone into argument finds no emotional fuel to sustain it. Without the familiar reaction, the interaction changes shape. Sometimes the other person loses interest quickly because the dynamic they relied on no longer functions. Other times, the situation dissolves naturally because the energy that once sustained it is absent. This is when people begin to describe the experience in unusual ways. They say certain problems stopped finding them. They say certain personalities stopped interfering in their lives. They say situations that used to appear repeatedly somehow disappeared. From the outside, this can sound mysterious, as if the world itself shifted in response to some inner realization. But when you look through the lens of systems and interaction, the explanation becomes more grounded. The cycle required a predictable response, and that response is no longer guaranteed. Without it, the pattern struggles to sustain itself. It is similar to what happens in a conversation where one person stops participating in an argument. The other person may try once or twice to restart the conflict, repeating the same phrases or pushing the same emotional buttons. But if the expected reaction never arrives, the structure of the argument collapses, not because someone won, but because the interaction that kept it alive disappeared. Over time, the environment begins to reorganize around this new absence. The triggers that once worked reliably lose their effectiveness. The system gradually shifts its attention toward variables that still produce clear responses elsewhere. And that is when many people begin to feel as if they have quietly stepped outside a certain type of pressure that once surrounded them. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through the absence of the reaction that once made the cycle possible. Yet this is also the moment when a subtle misunderstanding can appear, one that quietly pulls many people back into the very patterns they had begun to step away from. When people first notice that certain conflicts stop appearing, or that familiar pressures lose their grip, a very tempting conclusion begins to form in the mind. It feels like victory. After years of reacting, struggling, defending, and trying to escape repeating situations, the quiet disappearance of those patterns can feel like proof that something has been conquered. The mind wants to explain it. It wants to turn the experience into a strategy, a method, something that can be used deliberately. And this is where a subtle misunderstanding begins. Many people assume that stepping outside these cycles means defeating the system that once reacted to them. They imagine that they have somehow outsmarted it, resisted it, or broken free from its influence. But that interpretation quietly recreates the same dynamic that sustained the cycle in the first place. Because the moment the mind frames the experience as a fight, the system becomes an opponent again, and opponents demand engagement. The truth is far less dramatic but much more interesting. What actually changes is not the existence of the system, and not even the presence of the triggers themselves. The world continues functioning exactly as before. The same personalities still behave in familiar ways. The same environments still carry the same tensions. What disappears is the predictable interaction. Without that interaction, the pattern loses its structure. Imagine a stage where a play has been performed for years. The actors know their roles perfectly. One person provokes, another defends. One criticizes, another explains. One pushes harder, the other reacts emotionally. The script has been rehearsed so many times that the scene unfolds almost automatically, but one day one of the actors simply stops performing their role. The stage still exists. The other actors are still present. The lines are still ready to be spoken, yet the scene cannot continue in the same way. This is what many people misunderstand about leaving these cycles. It is not about destroying the stage or silencing the other actors. The system remains exactly where it was. What changes is participation in the script. When the expected reaction no longer appears, the system does not experience defeat. It experiences irrelevance. The pattern that once involved you no longer finds the signal it relied on, and without that signal, the system gradually redirects its attention elsewhere. This is why trying to beat the system often pulls people right back into it. The moment someone tries to prove they have escaped, they begin interacting with the pattern again. They start watching for it, anticipating it, reacting to it in subtle ways. And reaction, even when it feels controlled, is still a signal. The deeper shift is quieter than that. It happens when a person stops organizing their attention around the system entirely. The triggers that once dominated their awareness simply lose their importance. The emotional pathways that once activated quickly no longer feel necessary to follow. There is no need to resist the system because the interaction that sustained the pattern has already weakened. From the outside, this can look almost effortless. Someone who once reacted strongly to criticism now listens calmly and moves on. A person who used to become entangled in conflict no longer feels the same urgency to engage. Situations that once demanded emotional energy now pass by with far less impact. To observers, it may look like discipline or emotional control, but internally, it feels different. It feels more like something that has lost its relevance. The triggers are still visible, but they no longer pull attention in the same way. The system can still operate, but it no longer finds the predictable response it once relied on. And when that predictable response disappears, the pattern gradually loses the ability to organize itself around you. Yet even at this stage, there is another challenge waiting quietly in the background, one that often appears precisely when someone begins to understand how these mechanisms actually work. When someone begins to understand how these cycles operate, the realization can feel powerful. Suddenly, situations that once seemed chaotic begin to make sense. You start recognizing the triggers, the reactions and the feedback loops that keep certain dynamics alive. Patterns that once felt mysterious now appear almost mechanical. At first, this awareness creates a sense of freedom. You notice the moment a trigger appears. You see the emotional reaction forming before it fully takes over. You recognize the script that once played automatically. For a while it feels like you have stepped outside the pattern and can observe it from a distance. But this is exactly where a new kind of trap can quietly form, because the mind does something very predictable when it believes it has discovered a powerful insight. It wants to confirm it. It wants to demonstrate that it understands. It wants proof, and proof requires interaction. A person who has recently noticed these patterns may begin testing the idea without realizing it. They might watch closely for situations that used to trigger them, almost waiting to see if the system will try again. When someone behaves in a familiar way, the mind becomes alert. Here it is, it thinks. This is the pattern. In that moment, attention becomes intensely focused on the trigger. The person may believe they are observing calmly, but internally there is often a subtle tension, a readiness to react, a quiet effort to prove that this time they will not fall into the same cycle. But that effort itself becomes a signal. The mind is still organizing its awareness around the system. It is still watching the triggers carefully, measuring reactions, evaluating whether the pattern is working or failing. And that focus can slowly pull the person back into the very dynamic they thought they had left behind. Not through obvious emotional reactions, but through something much quieter, the desire to prove control. When someone tries to demonstrate that they are no longer affected, they often end up engaging with the system again in subtle ways. They may respond differently than before, but the interaction still exists. The trigger appears, the mind analyzes it, and attention locks onto it. From the system's perspective, the signal has returned. This is why many people come very close to stepping outside these cycles, only to find themselves pulled back in later. They understood the mechanism, but the mind turned that understanding into another form of engagement. Instead of reacting emotionally, they began reacting intellectually. Instead of defending themselves outwardly, they began proving something internally. But both responses still revolve around the same center of gravity. The system remains the reference point. There is a quiet irony here. The more someone tries to show that they are no longer influenced by the pattern, the more attention they give to it. And attention, just like emotional reaction, can keep a system active. Think of someone trying very hard not to think about a specific idea. The more effort they put into avoiding it, the more present it becomes in their mind. The resistance itself keeps the idea alive. The same principle can appear here. Trying to demonstrate freedom from the system can become another form of participation in it. The deeper shift happens when the need to prove anything disappears. When someone no longer feels the urge to confirm that the pattern is gone, their attention naturally moves elsewhere. They stop scanning the environment for triggers. They stop measuring whether people behave differently toward them. Life simply continues. The triggers may still exist somewhere in the background, but they no longer occupy the center of awareness. The mind is not trying to defeat them or analyze them constantly. It is no longer playing the game. And when that quiet shift takes place, something interesting begins to emerge. The absence of effort creates a different kind of stability, one where the old triggers lose their influence, not because they were resisted, but because the reactions they depended on no longer arise in the same way. There comes a point where the shift stops feeling like something you are trying to do. In the beginning, awareness requires effort. You notice the trigger. You pause. You watch the reaction forming. It feels almost like a skill you are practicing. You are careful with your responses, attentive to your emotions, trying not to fall back into the patterns that once controlled your reactions. But over time, something softer begins to happen. The pause no longer feels forced. The observation becomes natural. Instead of monitoring yourself constantly, you simply experience situations without the same urgency to react. It is not discipline anymore. It is a different relationship with the trigger itself. The things that once activated strong emotional responses are still present in the world, but they no longer feel like switches that control your behavior. The words people say, the pressures that appear, the small provocations that once pulled you into arguments or tension, they pass through your awareness differently. You notice them, but they do not immediately demand a reaction. This is the moment when the idea of becoming invisible begins to make sense, though not in the dramatic way the word might suggest. You have not vanished from the world. You are still speaking, working, interacting, and living your life like anyone else. The difference is much quieter. The patterns that once recognized your reactions no longer find the signals they depended on. And without those signals, the system has nothing stable to engage with. Think about how habits work in the human brain. A habit forms when a cue consistently leads to a specific response. Over time, the brain links the cue and the response together so tightly that the behavior becomes automatic. But if the cue appears repeatedly without producing the expected response, the connection begins to weaken. The brain gradually stops associating the two events with the same certainty. The pathway fades. Something similar happens in the interactions between individuals and the systems around them. When someone consistently reacts to pressure with frustration, that reaction becomes part of the system's expectations. The environment learns how to activate it. Certain dynamics continue appearing because they reliably produce the same response. But when that response stops happening in the usual way, the pattern begins to lose its stability. At first, the trigger may appear again. The system may attempt to activate the old pathway, almost like testing whether the signal is still there. Someone might repeat the same behavior that once provoked a reaction. A familiar situation might reappear briefly, but if the expected response does not return, the system slowly stops investing energy in that interaction. From its perspective, the variable has become unreliable. This is the quiet point where many people notice that certain pressures simply stop organizing themselves around their lives. The same personalities may still exist, but they direct their energy elsewhere. Situations that once escalated quickly now dissolve before gaining momentum, not because you avoided them, not because you defeated them, but because the predictable reaction that once sustained the interaction is no longer present. What makes this stage different from earlier attempts to control reactions is the absence of effort. You are not actively suppressing emotions or pretending not to care. In fact, emotions still appear when situations are meaningful. The difference is that the old triggers no longer dictate your internal state. There is space between what happens around you and what happens inside you. In that space, responses become choices rather than automatic outputs. Some situations still deserve attention or action, but the reaction no longer arrives before awareness. You are no longer pulled instantly into the same emotional loops. From the outside, nothing dramatic may be visible. But from the perspective of the patterns that once relied on your reactions, something essential has changed. The system that once interacted with you through predictable triggers now finds fewer and fewer points of contact. And when a system loses the variables that once activated it, its relationship to those variables begins to fade. This is why people sometimes describe the experience in simple but curious terms. They say it feels as if certain dynamics no longer recognize them, as if the invisible mechanisms that once pulled them into tension no longer know how to respond, which leads to a deeper question about what it actually means when the system stops seeing someone in the first place. When people hear the phrase, "the system stops seeing you," it can sound mysterious, almost as if someone disappears from the world or becomes untouchable by its pressures. But the reality is much quieter and far more grounded than that. Nothing magical happens. You still live in the same society. You still interact with the same kinds of people, structures, expectations, and challenges that everyone else faces. The system does not vanish, and it does not lose its power in a global sense. What changes is something much more specific. You stop participating in a particular pattern of interaction that the system once recognized in you. To understand this clearly, it helps to think of systems not as entities with intentions, but as networks of responses. Systems react to signals. They organize themselves around variables that produce reliable outcomes. If a behavior consistently generates a response, the system keeps using that pathway. If the response disappears, the pathway gradually loses its function. For a long time, many people unknowingly provide clear signals to the systems around them. their emotional reactions, their need to defend themselves, their urgency to correct others, their sensitivity to certain triggers, all of these become part of the feedback loop. The system learns how to engage them. Certain personalities instinctively push the same buttons. Certain environments produce the same pressures. Certain conversations follow familiar scripts. The person feels constantly pulled into situations they never asked for. But when awareness begins to change those internal reactions, the signals become less predictable. The triggers may still appear, but the response no longer follows the old pattern. A comment that once provoked immediate frustration now meets calm observation. A situation that once triggered anxiety now receives a slower, more measured response. Sometimes the reaction does not appear at all. From the inside, this feels like clarity. You are simply no longer compelled to react in the same way. From the perspective of the system, something else is happening. The variable it once interacted with has changed. Imagine trying to open a lock with a key that used to work perfectly. For years, the mechanism responded immediately when the key was inserted. The lock turned, the door opened, the interaction was reliable. But one day the key no longer fits the same way. The lock still exists, the door is still there, but the mechanism does not respond as it once did. After a few attempts, you stop trying to use that key. This is similar to what happens when someone stops feeding the patterns that once kept them visible within a certain system. The triggers that used to activate them lose their reliability. Attempts to pull them into familiar emotional loops produce weaker results. The interaction becomes inefficient. Over time, the system simply redirects its energy toward variables that still produce strong responses elsewhere. This is why some people notice that certain kinds of tension gradually disappear from their lives. Not every challenge vanishes, and not every difficult person disappears. But the specific dynamics that once trapped them in repeating cycles begin to lose their presence. It is not because the system stopped existing. It is because the system stopped recognizing them as someone participating in that particular game. And this distinction matters. Leaving a pattern does not mean escaping reality. It means stepping out of a feedback loop that once shaped how reality responded to you. The world is still complex, unpredictable, and sometimes difficult, but the invisible scripts that once pulled you into the same emotional reactions lose their power. Instead of constantly reacting, you move through situations with a different kind of stability. When challenges appear, you respond with awareness rather than reflex. And because those reflexive signals are no longer being broadcast in the same way, the system no longer organizes the same patterns around you. This is the quiet shift that many people struggle to explain when they experience it. They often say that life begins to feel lighter, not because everything becomes easy, but because the invisible pressure that once surrounded certain situations seems to dissolve. What actually dissolved was the loop. And once you see that clearly, a different kind of question begins to appear, one that turns your attention inward rather than outward. Not how to escape the system, but which reactions even now might still be feeding the cycles that keep you visible within it. What changes everything is not the world around you, but the moment you begin to see the pattern of your own reactions. For a long time, it can feel as if life keeps pushing the same buttons again and again, the same conflicts, the same tensions, the same emotional loops. But once you start noticing how those reactions complete the cycle, something shifts quietly inside you. The pressure loses its grip because the response it depended on is no longer automatic. The system didn't disappear. You simply stepped out of the pattern it knew how to use, and that awareness changes how reality meets you. If you stayed with this reflection until the end, write in the comments, "I see the pattern now." This lets me know you made it all the way here. And if this perspective resonated with you, take a moment to watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. There's another idea there that can deepen this understanding even further.